Hi, my name is Aaron Trinidad. Today I'm going to be talking to you about non-ordinary states of consciousness, also known as altered states of consciousness. I will also discuss the implications of non-ordinary states of consciousness from a biological, psychological, and social perspective. My goal here is to incorporate the concepts I learned from our biopsych course with the research that I came across and present this information as best as possible. So if you're a person who might be wondering how to better yourself, or maybe you have a mental illness, or maybe you have questions you don't have the answers to, or problems that you don't have the solutions for, and this topic should interest you. But first, I want you to consider this quote that from Sharon Begley in her book "Train Your Mind, Change Your Brain." The quote reads, "Since science always focused on people and conditions that are pathological, disturbed, or at best normal. In the past 30 years, there have been about 46,000 scientific studies on depression and an underwhelming 400 on joy. As long as someone can obtain non-sickness, that is deemed sufficient. As Buddhist scholar Alan Watts puts it, Western sciences have an underlying assumption that normal is absolutely as good as it gets, and that the exceptional is only for saints, that is something that cannot be cultivated." So the importance of the quote is that we're so engaged in just getting to baseline what we think normal is, pretty much getting our heads above water. But in the book that I read, Stealing Fire, they suggest that we could be using these same concepts that heal us, that take us from mental illness to normalness, and use them to get from normal to better, extraordinary. And I think what they're trying to say is there's this sort of stigma that you shouldn't be doing certain things to make yourself better. They're for people who are sick. Anyway. So before we get started, I just wanted to kind of talk about why I'm covering this topic, and it's because I have this knack for, I have like an interest in things that like are inexplicable, things that are infinite, and things that are uncharted. And I used to like space a lot, because we used to. I used to like space a lot, just because it's this cosmic expanse that we know almost nothing about, and the same goes for the human brain, except the human brain is a little more fundamental, because that's where everything begins. Everything that we know begins, and I think it's important to bring this up because just like space, how we have probes and other devices for exploration for space, we also have things like non-ordinary states of consciousness that can serve as a tool for exploring the human brain. So to understand non-ordinary states of consciousness, I think it's important that we understand consciousness itself. So how do we define something that is, in a sense, everything? Understanding the perspectives of consciousness will give us a clear understanding of non-ordinary states of consciousness. So there's two perspectives. There's the psychophysical monism and mind-body dualism. In a lecture by Dr. K, Psychophysical monism suggests that psychological events, which consist of the mind and its processes such as consciousness, memory, emotion, and perception, um, and physical events taking place in the material brain are one and the same thing. Mind is equivalent to physical brain function on this view. Mind-body dualism suggests that mind and matter are two separate things, independent of one another. Mind is not material according to mind-body dualists on this view. Your thoughts, feelings, perceptions, and other mental events are non-material events which occur without being dependent for their existence on your physical brain activity. I think being familiar with both concepts will give you a more intuitive understanding of altered states of consciousness. So another thing that would give us a better understanding of non-ordinary states of consciousness are technological advances. Technology is definitely key in contributing to a lot of these findings. They are the tools of observation, data recording, and data analysis. The example we have here is functional magnetic imaging, functional magnetic resonance imaging. It's where so here's the machine, and here's like the actual like pictures that it produces. What it shows is the concentration of oxygen in the brain in specific regions. The higher the concentration of the oxygen, the more active that site is, and they read it by color coding, and it's important because they use it for localization of functioning, and also mapping specific circuitries involved in specific tasks, situations, and things like that. So another device and another type of technology that we use to help us understand non-ordinary states of consciousness, or just consciousness in general, and brain functioning is electroencephalography, or EEG. We use them to establish normal and abnormal states of consciousness and normal abnormal patterns. Mapping, we also use that for mapping localization of function. Neurofeedback, which is a really interesting concept where we can actually train our brain by giving ourselves rewards and taking away those rewards when our brain isn't acting the way we want it to. It also helps diagnose mental disorders. And speaking of mental disorders, this is how complex they can get with EEG readings. So it's not just this that we use. This is the actual readings from each of the electrodes. And this is like data analysis using topography too. Looks like they're using fMRI over here and applying all three of them together, and statistical analysis and such to use to diagnose things like ADHD. But what you're seeing here are them kind of mapping the waves, or they're using the patterns of the waves to establish patterns, and each wave is considered an ERP, which is an event related potential. They also establish, like I was saying, certain patterns. Patterns being like things like alpha, beta, gamma, delta. Delta being the lowest with 0 to 4 hertz, and gamma being the highest with 38 to 42 hertz, which basically just means that like the higher the frequency, the more event related potentials in 1 second. But yeah, that's how they establish certain patterns, and that's the different patterns have to do with different states of consciousness. So ordinary consciousness. That's the opposite of non-ordinary, obviously. They also refer to it as normal waking consciousness. Consciousness, thoughts, feelings, and memories, perceptions of the world. Typically, our waking consciousness oscillates between beta and alpha. This is us sleeping. This is where it says problem solving, concentration. But yeah. So non-ordinary states of consciousness. So this guy, Stanislav Grof, actually defines it pretty well in a book that I read called Stealing Fire. They quote him and they say, or he says, non-ordinary states of consciousness are characterized by dramatic perceptual changes, intense and often unusual emotions, profound alterations in the thought processes and behavior, brought about by a variety of psychosomatic manifestations, ranging from profound terror to ecstatic rapture. There exists many forms of non-ordinary states of consciousness. They can be induced by a variety of different techniques or occur spontaneously in the middle of everyday life. So, so you don't have to be like an athlete or an artist to experience that's something else. Okay, so okay, so some significant states or non-ordinary states of consciousness are these that are listed here. It's flow states, meditative states, and intoxicated states. And I mentioned these three because they are the ones that I will be talking about in this presentation. Some other ones beyond these are I came across in NDEs. That's the state of consciousness and near-death experience. You're in that sort of state of mind. It's obviously a traumatic. Your brain's going through some traumatic physiological events. But interestingly enough, about the NDEs is the studies on NDEs show they reinforce a lot of the concepts that flow states, meditative states, and intoxicated states suggest in that studies of NDE survivors or people who experience NDEs. They experience lasting effects on the physiology of their brain and the connections in their brain, showing that like something that's just it's such an acute time frame can have a lasting effect, and yeah, I think that's an important study to bring up involving these. But we can actually measure. We can actually observe the difference caused by a near-death experience. Like, so it's like overnight, their brains have totally changed. Anyway, so some methods of achieving non-ordinary states of consciousness: mindfulness training, physical training, ingesting chemical compounds like alcohol, psychedelics, technology. Virtual reality can take you out of your normal state of your normal state of consciousness. TMS, which is transcranial magnetic stimulation, can do the same. TMS can actually induce flow states by creating a magnetic field in certain parts of your prefrontal cortex. They can actually induce a flow state with TMS. Very interesting stuff. Also, sensory deprivation tanks are used as well. And I would assume that those would put you in kind of like a meditative state. Purpose? Well, the purpose that I think non-ordinary states of consciousness can serve, or at least that's relevant to this presentation, are therapy and cognitive / performance enhancement. And then ecstasis. I will be talking about that right now. So, I read a book called Stealing Fire, and it gave me a lot of ideas and inspired a lot of thoughts in me. I'll be quoting a lot from Stealing Fire in this presentation, but it's a book about non-ordinary states of consciousness, and they have this central theme to the book called ecstasis, and to be or stand outside of oneself. So ecstasis is the Greek origin of the word ecstasy, even though it's not really, doesn't have too much to do with it, not related to the drug, that's for sure. But I believe that ecstasis is the purpose. To be or stand outside of oneself is the purpose of non-ordinary states of consciousness. They use ecstasis as the central theme, and what I understand ecstasis to be is the immediate outcome of non-ordinary states of consciousness. I think once we are outside of ourselves, breaking our normal train of thought, we have an opportunity for change. With the right intentions and the right guidance, we can use this opportunity for change to better ourselves. So, flow states. So, flow states are defined as being in the zone. As I mentioned earlier about athletes and artists and musicians, they routinely engage in flow when they're at competitions, when they're in 3 hours into a 10-hour painting. Other people who experience flow routinely, like maybe a SWAT team participating in a raid. But flow emerges from an action that requires specific skills and challenges. Many of us have experienced this state at one point or another, but the question is, how do we more readily access this state, and how do we potentiate it? So the writers of the book that I was just talking about, Stealing Fire, Jamie Wheal and Stephen Kotler, they are founders of the Flow Genome Project, and so what they do is they're trying to map all of the factors that contribute to flow states and utilize them to cultivate higher performance in individuals. So they're currently revolutionizing our understanding of flow states and and utilizing them. But this guy, Mihaly C., he was the leading researcher on positive psychology. One of the leading researchers, I should say, one of the leading researchers. But he defines flow as the psychology of optimal experience. So he's pretty much the father of flow state, the concept of flow states. And I like this diagram here because it kind of shows you, so talking about challenge level and skill, it's bringing it to the max, and that's how you get there. You have to be challenged enough, and you have to have the skill level to achieve it. So next is meditative states. Contemplation and visualization are types of meditation. Mindfulness is another type. Transcendental meditation. So what you're trying to do with meditation is you're trying to bring your mind, you're trying to train your mind, and with like mindfulness, for example, you're trying to bring your mind, your full mind, to an object, like your breath. You're trying to, if you're being mindful to your breath, for example, you're trying to improve your awareness of your breath, and it's just that one thing, that one object that you're trying to be mindful of, and it's like it's a training process. It's kind of hard, so it takes training and time and experience. But according to one article, mindfulness meditators have reduced physiological arousal and distraction from vague thoughts. And like this is useful for treating ADHD. Mindfulness meditation can induce neuroplasticity, and so there's a study into mindfulness meditation that supports evidence of alpha and theta rise by observing the spectral analysis of recorded EEG. But also, by contrast, Buddhist meditators, specifically Buddhist meditators, are characterized by high amplitude gamma oscillations. So that just suggests to you like the versatility of meditative states, and the different types of training that's involved. Apparently, you can accomplish a lot of things. So, for those of you interested in evolution and comparative studies of other organisms and humans to better understand ourselves, this should be very, very interesting. Intoxication, an evolutionary tale. So this concept I got, well, this quote I got, and the concept I got from Stealing Fire. Super interesting stuff. I've thought about this conceptually before, but never worded it like that. So this is a quote by Ron Siegel. He's a UCLA psychopharmacologist, and he says, drug seeking and drug taking are biologically normal behaviors. In a sense, pursuit of intoxicating drugs in animals is the rule rather than the exception. The pursuit of intoxication with drugs is a primary motivational force. So, that's what he's trying to say is that, or what he did say in the book was that, that intoxication has been observed in other animals. I think he mentions like baboons, how they eat iboga, which contains ibogaine. Elephants, they'll eat fermented fruit. Cats like catnip. And they even mention in the book how dolphins eat, or they play with pufferfish, and pufferfish release like a neurotoxin that gets them high. And there's a few other examples in the book of animals getting intoxicated, and obviously humans get intoxicated. And so if that comparatively, if a bunch of organisms are doing it, or all organisms in a sense, then it should be considered a biologically normal behavior, according to Ronald Siegel. And he even suggests that is it is the fourth evolutionary drive, with food, water, and sex. And why is that? Well, they talk about the law of conservation, in evolution, and how we keep, and how behaviors that work for us for our survival and reproduction, we tend to keep and hold on to because it works. But sometimes we hold on to behaviors that don't work. We get stuck in a rut, as they say. And so intoxication would be an opposition to the law of conservation, by depatterning. So yeah, depatterning. By depatterning a bad behavior, you are eliminating it from an organism's life and perhaps its lineage. And I put psychedelics here because I think they are the most powerful tool, or a powerful tool, for depatterning in the realm of intoxication. So psychedelics. So now I want to turn the page to psychedelics. I have much more material to cover here since my outside class activity was specifically about psychedelics. And I happen to think that psychedelics are perhaps the most effective tool we can use to reap the benefits of non-ordinary states of consciousness. In addition to my research, psychedelics has tested all my knowledge that I have gained from this course, from their effects on the sensory systems, to its mechanisms of action, to its effect on behavior, to their clinical applications for treating mental illness. Understanding the full nature of psychedelics definitely requires a biological psychology approach. Anyway, so I think to understand psychedelics, at least to understand psychedelics now, we have to understand where we came from, like what our understanding was before. And to understand that, I think introducing or talking about the nomenclature, evolution of nomenclature, shows a lot about what we understood then and what we understand now. We used to call them psychotomimetics, which means mimic psychosis. So we used to think they made us crazy. We moved to hallucinogen, produces hallucinations, not much better. Psychedelic. Then we start getting a little bit deeper, which means mind, soul manifesting. Entheogen, cultivate divine from within. That one's kind of cool. That's probably where they get it's probably how they understood ayahuasca, maybe, or whatever the religious sacraments had to do with that. Anyway, actogen, to touch within. Psychoplastogen induces neuronal plasticity. And so this is actually new, like very, very new. It came from this term came from this study, which was a study on the neuroplastic effects of psychedelics. We'll go over that in a bit, but interesting to see that we've come to this now and that we're labeling them as such. And I put this here because it reminded me of a quote from a lecture that we had, or an assignment, and the quote was, "Neurons that fire together wire together." And as you can see here, it says communication pathways, psilocybin, communication going on there, and the placebo, nowhere near as much. So if we are having that much, I guess you could say some of it's crosstalk. We have neurons that are communicating that usually don't. have active areas that aren't usually active. Imagine that happening, and then the concept of neurons that fire together, wire together. You have neuroplasticity. So reasons for use of psychedelic substances: curiosity, all the way down to sociocultural phenomena. Festival culture, religious sacrament, which is what I was talking about. Festivals culture, cool stuff. I just got back from EDC literally yesterday. Medication and healing, anxiety, PTSD, headaches. This is clinical applications. Exploration of consciousness, growth, creativity, problem solving. So I bolded, underlined, and italicized that because whereas a lot of these wouldn't necessarily resonate with everybody, this should resonate with everybody because we could all grow. We could all use some creativity, problem solving, definitely. Get high. People like to get high, apparently. Recreational or psycho-spiritual. So I was thinking about this one, and whenever I hear recreational, I imagine that people think that like it's for fun, and I don't necessarily. So what my connection with that was, I think that there's a fine line between recreational and therapeutic, because what's recreational can be therapeutic, and maybe not vice versa, but my point is they're both used to be, you're using it to achieve happiness, to achieve not just normalcy, but wellness. And if you're using something that's not, it's not toxic to you, it's not addictive, and you're using it to like have a good time, that can be therapeutic. That could be beneficial for your life. You could go on to the next day a better person, happier, because of a recreational session with a psychedelic, as long as it's not bad and you're not overdoing it. That's my opinion. So clinically significant psychedelics, two main categories: tryptamines and phenethylamines. Dimethyltryptamine is a tryptamine, obviously. LSD is a tryptamine. Psilocybin is a tryptamine. Phosphoroxydimethyltryptamine, psilocybin. And phenethylamines, tryptamine. Wait, that's not supposed to be there. Sorry, but so phenethylamines, the clinically significant ones, MDMA and mescaline. Ketamine does not fall into those two categories, but is significantly clinically significant. So psychedelics, biological mechanisms. So they both have effects on 5-HT. In what ways? These ways. Phenethylamines causes the release of 5-HT from presynaptic neurons. 5-HT, by the way, is serotonin. Tryptamines mimic 5-HT and bind to postsynaptic receptors. And it says here, serotonin analogs modulate DNA expression, which is a very crazy concept, one that I have not fully understood yet. In my research, like what that implies in terms of its effect on the behavior of the individual, I don't fully understand yet, and I mean, I guess we'll talk about that in a second. But So here's what they look like. As you can see, where's 5-HT? Okay, so here's 5-HT, that's serotonin. And here's DMT, here's 5-MeO-DMT, psilocybin. They look almost like it. They're analogs. So yeah, interesting stuff. And so in our book, we learned that a monoamine like serotonin is a metabotropic receptor associated with the metabotropic receptor. So what that means is, so here it is. Here's the synaptic transmission of serotonin. These would do the same thing. And then so here is a G protein coupled receptor. And here's the neurotransmitter, which in this case is 5-HT, binding to the receptor, activating the G protein. A subunit of the G protein breaks off, activates a second messenger. That second messenger can actually enter the nucleus of a neuron and attach to bind to the DNA of that neuron and alter or modulate the DNA expression. What that means, I don't really know, but I'm guessing it has to do with the symptoms or the effects that you experience while you're high on whatever psychedelic this happens to be, that you ingest. The effects of it must have something to do with the modulation of DNA expression. That's my guess. I don't know. I haven't read anything on it yet. But neuroplasticity, maybe it has to do with the neuroplasticity. So psychedelics and neuroplasticity. This is that study from the psychoplastogen page, the nomenclature page. Here we have the compounds that we're talking about, and here we have cortical tissue. And what they did was they had cortical tissue like on a